Hey, welcome to episode 16 of the L24 engine rebuild series. And in this video, I was just kind of doing some of the stuff on the underside of the engine. So you can see me here putting in the oil baffle screen and then this retaining plate here. You have to actually push the screen down pretty far. Also here, I think the machine shop honestly stripped the screw heads a little bit too much. So I went to the hardware store and just purchased equivalent bolts. I believe, don't quote me on this, check it yourself, but I think they're M8 bolts with a 1.25 pitch. And I decided to go with the hex head just to make it a little bit easier and to prevent any kind of screws stripping out again. And they look pretty nice in there. And next I installed the oil pump pickup, which you can see just takes a gasket here that's installed dry. And just start the two bolts there. And I required that the inch-pounds torque wrench that I have, the foot-pounds is just too high of a starting range for a lot of these installations. Certainly do them in two steps. I try to do two, maybe three steps for torquing them up. And this is just kind of like a light click. All right, so I wanted to take one last look inside the bottom side of the engine because I'm getting ready to install the oil pan here, which I actually gave to my dad. And he put a lot of filler on it and painted it originally. But when he shipped it to me, it had a little bit of, I guess some of the paint job got just kind of scuffed during shipping. So I decided to put kind of like a final coat on it here. So I actually did that earlier, and then some of the stuff that you've seen before was just what I did while I was waiting for that to dry, including installing the gasket. You'll see there that I had some RTV on the front, which is where the front cover meets the block on the flange, I guess, where the oil pan is bolted down. But that's the only spot where you need RTV. I was kind of worried because if you saw in the one video, the black that I was painting on didn't look too great. But one of the things about satin black is that it never really looks totally great until it dries. You can see here it's still kind of drying a little bit, but it looks way better than it did in that first video. So next I installed all of the oil pan bolts here. Didn't torque them down yet, but I believe there's 33 of them, so it's enough of a job just to get them installed to begin with. Make sure when you install these bolts you use anti-seize on the threads. Not only does this make it a little bit easier for when you or somebody in the future wants to remove these, it also lubricates the threads and gives you a true torque rating. Alright, so next I installed the front cover bolts. They are a series of M6 and M8 bolts. One thing to notice here is that for these top two M6 bolts, you need a crow's foot attachment to access them to the point where you can actually rotate the socket wrench. Just a regular socket, you'll have difficulties there. And yeah, so it usually requires just a little bit of maneuvering around there, but it allows you to actually torque those bolts down. The torque ratings for these are different for the M6 and the M8 bolts. For the M6, they recommend 2.9 to 7.2 foot-pounds. And for the M8 bolts, they recommend 7.2 to 12 foot-pounds. And this is from the Nissan, or How to Rebuild Your Nissan Datsun Overhead Cam Engine. I think I linked it in one of the very first videos here, but it's a super helpful resource. And a lot of the stuff you see here in these videos is regurgitated from there anyway, but it's really good to have kind of like a textbook resource for, hey, what's the torque rating? What gets this? What do you do with certain gaskets and anti-seize and stuff like that? Which, speaking of, make sure that you use anti-seize with these bolts and install them in kind of two segments for a lower rating and then slowly get up to wherever it is you're trying to torque them to. All right, so next up for installation is the oil pump. You can see the drive gear here from my old oil pump that obviously I had cleaned up prior to installation. One thing to note is that for installing the oil pump, you want piston number 1 at TC, and I would read the book for a little more information on that. I don't know if I could do it justice here. I don't have the videos for it. I also pre-filled the oil pump with the 10W30 that I'm going to eventually put into the engine anyway. And then you can rotate the drive shaft a little bit just to see it bubbling up and ensure, hey, it is pumping, which is good for an oil pump. I installed the gasket here. Make sure that you line up the shaft so that the timing mark on the gear hub aligns with the oil squirt hole. I installed applied some grease to this gear. I think I probably should have got more on there, but I'm sure it'll be okay. I also applied just some regular oil to the shaft itself, rotated the engine so that I could just kind of easily push this up into here. Some people say you should be off to the left and then rotate it in. This was fine enough for me. It seemed to be okay, but it wasn't totally straight. I'll show you in a second. But you can hold it where you can install one bolt, and then the next three are much easier to install. These get torqued down to 8 to 11 foot-pounds. So you're supposed to be able to line up a screwdriver just right across the right side of the top bolt and the left side of the bottom. I'm not quite there. I'm not sure if I'm going to have to redo that, but that can be done at any time up before the distributor is installed. So I can come back to that later if need be. I made a huge mess of this, but I did get an even coat of RTV on this back side, despite the fact that it doesn't really look like it. But that was enough where I can install it solidly. Of course, kind of you want to pat down every edge to make sure that it seats just on its own. Of course, when you install it with the bolts, it's going to make it push against that anyway, but it's always good at this stage to make sure everything lines up, especially with bolt holes and stuff like that. With this, you want RTV on both sides. And I think I did a little bit better job here. Just certainly getting more here. I do think I'm going to ditch the gloves. I thought that was a good way to keep things clean, but honestly, it's so hard to spread that with the glove on. It's probably easier just to walk up and wash your hands in between if you want to keep things clean. But got even application across everything here, and I was ready to install the water pump itself. So next I installed the water pump itself. This is pretty easy to get positioned just because if you remember from the disassembly, there are those two kind of mini studs on the left and right side. So I'm not sure if it'll rest on that, but it's easy enough just to make sure it's in the right position. Your gasket's in the right position, so then it's just a matter of getting one of the bolts threaded so that it'll sit down there on its own, and then you can take your time with the rest of the bolts and install them with a socket wrench. Torque the M6 bolts to 3 to 7 foot-pounds and the M8 bolts to 8 to 12 foot-pounds. So definitely an odd time to do this, but I decided to torque down the Harmonic balancer bolt, which actually was a socket fused with the original bolt. I did end up getting it out there, but it took a lot of some very inventive techniques with the vise to get it out of there. It's called a 26 millimeter bolt, but it's definitely bigger than that, I think. So I would recommend buying a 27 millimeter socket of some kind if you want to work with that. I just decided to buy a new bolt because my old one was so mangled by the fight. I applied some thread locker to either side of the bolt. This is one of the few things that you do want thread locker on because you don't want this thing going anywhere. Be sure to apply any hardware that came off of the engine with it when you uninstalled this bolt. You can thread it in as far as it'll go by hand before bringing out a regular socket wrench, and then eventually you can bring out the big guns in the torque wrench. Of course, you want to stop the engine from rotating while you torque this down, so I just have 2 bolts in there, and then a piece of pipe there that kind of pushes up against the arms of the engine stand, and that has worked great and very reliably throughout this whole process for me. So I'm not sure why, but I did not get footage of actually finally torquing this bolt down. This is as good as I got, but you'll have to trust me that there was a nice click at the end when I got to 101 to 116 foot-pounds, which is what this calls for on an L24. With the Felpro kit, the water pump outlet gasket is bad. It doesn't fit at all. So I had to cut one, which was kind of difficult given the thick gasket material that I ended up with, but it worked fine. This gets gasket sealer RTV on the front and the back of the gasket, so I found it kind of easy to apply the one side, install it on there with the bolts, and then you can install the other side of RTV on there. So then it's kind of like one unit, and it's really easy just to sort of go in. I went in with the socket itself just to get it started much easier than by hand. And then I threaded in there nicely, and then these get torqued down to 7 to 12 foot-pounds. Next, I installed the oil pressure sender. Mine came with some kind of seal on the threads already. In the book, it says that you can torque these down to 7 to 12 foot-pounds, so you can just put a socket on there and torque it to 7 to 12 foot-pounds. Next, I prepared to install the thermostat housing, which also gets RTV on both sides of the gasket. And I use that same technique here where I applied the RTV to one side and then installed it to the thermostat housing with just the RTV on the one side. And then with the bolts in place, the gasket is in place, and then I can put some RTV on the other side as well. And in a moment here, you'll also see me put on some anti-seize on these bolts. The water inlet also gets anti-seize. Make sure you're looking at the book. in determining where you should be using anti-seize. But generally, if it's something that has to come out, and it's especially if it's going into like cast iron or anything like that, if it's going into the block, you're going to want anti-seize, or at least some form of lubricant on the bolts to give you a true torque rating, and because you want to get them out at some point. The thermostat housing to head bolts get torqued to 8 to 14 foot-pounds. So I'm not sure what orientation the element has to be. I don't know if it quite matters, but there are some things that seem to recommend that little stub should face the front, so that's what I did. I installed some gasket maker RTV on just one side of it, and then dropped that on top of the thermostat housing, and then I could apply more RTV to the other side. I also had to move up the valve cover a little bit because that gasket is pretty big and bulky, and it wouldn't sit flush without doing that. With everything on there, you can install the top cover piece there and install the bolts. Once threaded in by hand and by a regular socket wrench, these also get torqued down to 7 to 12 foot-pounds. Next, I applied some thread sealant to the sending unit. And I don't see a torque rating for this anywhere, so I just kind of threaded it in by hand and then just kind of used a wrench to get it pretty snug. Alright, so moving right along to the alternator mount, you'll see that the top right bolt hole here gets a stud, and then the other two will get bolts. So we're going to use that same technique we used before on the exhaust manifold, or just both manifold bolts, where you have two nuts jammed up against each other to thread it in, and then the opposite to take it off. So then you can just spin them off by hand, and then that bolt is installed. Now the reason you have the bolt here is because the mount itself is shaped in a way where you need to just start the one nut on the stud, get it pretty much all the way in, and then you can install the two bolts easily, and there's nothing obstructing. But you can see there, you wouldn't be able to fit a bolt in there, so that's why that needs it. So this is something that I am considering selling as a kit on my site, just the hardware that you need for this, because not only is it kind of an odd set of stuff, and I'm not sure if everyone's going to have it, but this nut that goes on the stud, on a conventional bolt, it's actually a little bit too small, but also too wide. And I found this JIS small wrench thing, which it's a smaller profile as far as the wrench going on it, but it's thicker, like you can see there, so it gives you a little more room. And it makes it way easier, because otherwise I was kind of just butting up against the mount there, and I was kind of not sure if I was getting a true torque rating. After that, all these get torqued down to 29 to 43 foot-pounds. Next, I installed the alternator and just kind of let it rest on that bottom kind of hinge spot there, because we're not quite ready to install the belt just yet. Moving back on up to the front cover area, I prepared the studs that go on the water pump that allowed the pulley and the fan clutch to be attached to the water pump. I applied some thread locker on that, just because you don't want those to move at all. Probably the best way to do this would be to install them how you want and then wait for the thread locker to take effect. I was a little bit impatient, so I just kind of jockeyed it against, unthreaded it a little bit, knowing that the nut, when you put it on there, is going to kind of thread it in a little bit more. Eventually, I got them to a point where they were all pretty even. But like I said, probably the best way to do this would be to just wait. At least I think that would work, where it would just kind of solidify it. But you can see here, all the studs were kind of out an even amount, and everything looks good. So next, I prepared to install the fuel pump. The top two bolt holes get studs, and then the bottom is going to be just a regular bolt to secure the fuel pump to the cylinder head. So obviously same technique as before to get these in here. Use some anti-seize, two nuts butted up against each other. This has a spacer with the gasket on either side. My spacer just came off of the engine. I did not get in the gasket kit or anything like that. This time I did have moly grease, which is what's recommended for this. And I installed it like this, pushing it in here. I secured the two nuts onto the studs there to get that part, the top part of it, secured onto the engine. And then you can install the bolt on the bottom and torque everything down. The book says to torque the nuts down to 7.2 to 13 foot-pounds. Does not say anything about the bolt, but I did the same. And ignore the belt there. I got the wrong size initially. At this point, I just installed a bunch of things that I wasn't able to install previously because I didn't have the hardware, and I purchased a bunch of hardware online, so I could install this stuff now. So some of the stuff that I don't show, I have a bunch of the hardware that goes on the valve cover, so I was able to install the spark plug wires because I had all the holders in place, and that kind of was nice to get a sense of what that looked like. But with the other engine slinger in place, I was able to lift the engine up so I could install this last freeze plug here. And honestly, it did not go in as far as I hoped. I think it might just be a super deep plug because it seemed like it was almost butting up against something. I would hate to think that that was the cylinder. But you could understand that if there was any chance that it was the cylinder, I didn't want to just keep hammering on it. And I think it's in good enough now where I guess if it were to leak, I mean, who cares? I'll show you in a second. I have a transmission bell housing. I would just see if it leaked, and I guess I would have to fix that. But I don't think there's any problems there. There's enough sealer in there that it'll be fine. But here's the transmission bell housing I found on eBay. It was about $100, which I think is kind of expensive, but it is a pretty big piece of metal, so I guess that makes some sense. And I just took all the hardware off here, and I already have it sent off for vapor honing, so I could have the exact same finish that I had on everything else aluminum that I sent out there. And I did get a chance to kind of get a sense of what it looks like, and the cool thing about that is that's what it's going to look like when I build the stand. With the stand, I want to be able to have the starter in place so that, first of all, you don't want a flywheel going around here all the time on a test stand. I'd like to have it protected, and I also want to use the factory starter, and that requires that. And also, it kind of balances a little bit more because I think with this stand, I plan to build the back of it at the transmission bell housing, and then the side mounts that the car uses are going to be kind of more in the middle then. So I think it'll work out pretty nice. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to build it. I think I'm just going to use some square tubing and just cut it. I don't have a welder and I don't know how to weld. So I think I'm just going to cut it and bolt everything together and then take it to a welder and just say, hey, make this sturdy. And then I can paint it, make everything look nice, and then, do all the electrical work and hopefully get it running. So a lot of cool stuff going on here, and I'm really excited to continue along. I would love if you could subscribe if you haven't already, and thank you so much to everyone who's followed along in these videos with me so far.